Okay. Do you guys recognize the picture at the back?
Yes.
Venerable Si took that picture on the first time we went to Bodhi Monastery back in 2016.
Yeah.
Okay, just let me share the screen. Okay, so let me adjust this. So, good morning again from Sydney, and it's Monday morning here. So it's I hope for the friends in the US, you've had a good weekend, and I hope that you weren't too confused after Venerable Tangsa's lessons yesterday. However, if there was anything that was just, over the top of your head or a bit unclear, use the opportunity at the end where he's left time to ask questions, to seek clarifications. Even if it's just, what did this term mean? Why do we have to know about this term and so forth? Just feel free to ask. So yesterday we were looking at the first 3 verses in chapter 2 of The Way to Buddhahood. So this is a brief summary of what those verses relate to. So verse 1 summarized the benefits of learning the Dharma. And then verse 2 pointed out some faults that we need to avoid when we're actually listening to Dharma teachings. And verse 3 covered 4 views that we should have, and this was explained using the doctor-patient relationship. So again, this is verse 1, and here it talks about the 4 types of benefits. So there are many, many benefits when we learn and listen to the Dharma teachings, but they can be categorized into 4 major categories. And the first one is that we can know about all dharmas. So we can know about phenomena and learn from the Buddhist perspective how we explain what happens in this world, what we see, what we experience, and so forth. And we also learn about things that we may not know, which is the importance. It's gaining knowledge, which then can help us in our lives and to direct us in terms of where we want to go. So the second is that after knowing about all these different types of dharmas and phenomena, we also then are able to learn about what is wholesome and what is unwholesome. So remember, unwholesome means that it's harmful to our progression on the path, and it nurtures more defilements rather than helping us to develop virtues. And the third is that through learning of the Dharma, we can tame and ultimately end all sorts of engagements in meaningless activities once we know that they're not effective towards the cultivation of the path. And finally, the 4th group of benefit is the attainment of liberation, nirvana. And in Buddhism, we refer to this as true nirvana, ultimate liberation from samsara altogether, unlike some of the ascetics who actually attain rebirth in the longevity heavens. And their lifespan is very, very long, into the eons long. So they misunderstand that that is nirvana, but they don't realize that that's not nirvana. And ultimately, once that lifespan ends, they will have to continue with cycling through the 6 realms. So these 4 aspects can be contemplated separately, individually, but you can also contemplate on them and reflect on them in a sequential manner. So, for example, the first benefit supports the second and the third benefits, which then lead to the fourth benefit. So when you're learning the Dharma, and we always instruct people who are keen to learn the Dharma to then contemplate about what you've learned, to reflect on what you've learned. This is one approach. You can reflect on the individual items. What do they mean? How do you apply it? And so forth. But then it's also helpful to then try to approach it in a sequential form. How does this aspect link to another aspect? So in this way, you're, excuse me, in this way, you're training yourself to begin to learn to connect things together. So once you're able to link the different things together and to link them in a logical manner that accords with the Dharma, then it's more, you're unlikely to get confused when you hear different teachings from different teachers, which is often the case. Some people will go and listen to one teacher and they'll say X, and then they listen to another teacher who says Y, and on the face of it, X and Y may seem contradictory. But if you think about it properly and you start to connect the two using what you've learned, and of course, when your Dharma knowledge has a certain depth to it, you can then actually see how they're not contradictory and how they're actually sequential, dependent on certain prior achievements and so forth. So this is a bit of a hint towards your homework when you're reflecting on and contemplating on the verses. Think about them individually. What are they trying to express? What are they trying to remind us to learn? And then also start to think about, well, how does verse 1, the content in verse 1, link to the content in verse 2 and 3 and so forth? So that again, the aim is on the fourth day, we can actually have a discussion to share our different views on how the content is linked together. So this is verse 2. And in verse 2, it introduces the similes of a vessel for collecting drinking water and the simile of planting seeds. So when we listen to the Dharma, there are faults that we must look out for, we must be mindful of, and we need to find ways to remedy those faults. So if we don't, then the time we spend listening to the Dharma will not be as productive as it could be. And that's why the Buddha always reminds the audience to listen attentively and then contemplate properly they've heard and bear in mind what they've heard as well. And then we come to verse 3, which tells us that we should think of ourselves like a patient. And that means we need to be able to recognize the symptoms of an illness and then seek the right treatment. So yesterday, this is where we finished off. And I have to stress that we need to understand that cyclic existence and our defilements of greed, hatred, and ignorance, as well as their associated subordinate defilements, all of these we should consider to be an illness. So just because we have defilements, don't think that, oh, I'm not good enough. Don't look down on yourself. Just think of it as an illness. And we need to be happy about the fact that such illnesses do have a cure. And it takes a lifelong commitment to learn and practice the Dharma in order to cure these illnesses, but it can be done. So we need to find ways to develop our courage, our dedication and endurance to go the distance with learning the Dharma. And the last line of this verse says, the Buddha says the Dharma is like a mirror. So this is where we will pick up with today's lesson. So the Buddha once said that the Dharma he teaches is like a mirror that can be used to view oneself. So you may think, how do we use the Dharma like a mirror? Well, first of all, a mirror doesn't lie. What you see is what is there. So whether it's beautiful or ugly, or whether it's pleasing or displeasing, it's all there. And when we learn the Dharma, we learn about wholesome behaviors and we learn about unwholesome behaviors. We learn about what is good and what is bad and so forth. So these teachings are what we can use or refer to as our check sheet or the mirror that we're looking into. So when we look into a mirror, we start to see things. And this is the same thing when we reflect on these wholesome and unwholesome behaviors. We observe ourselves accordingly and honestly. Sorry, I'll just turn off. So we need to reflect on ourselves accordingly and honestly. And that means we look at ourselves and we see, do we have some of these unwholesome traits? But we don't just look for the negativity. We also look at, do we have any of these wholesome traits? And most common is we have a bit of both. So we're not all bad. We've got, I'm sure that among all of us, we've got a lot of virtues as well. And there are areas that we can improve on. So we look carefully at what types of faults we have and what types of virtues we possess based on the Dharma teachings. So then, when we use the Dharma like a mirror, if upon reflection we find that we have certain faults, certain shortcomings, then we should know shame and repent and distance ourselves or work to distance ourselves from these shortcomings. But if we don't have any of these faults, then we actually should be happy. We can, give ourselves a pat on the back and acknowledge that we have these virtues or we don't have these faults. So remember, don't just look at your vices, also look at your virtues. So when you observe that you have certain virtues, certain good points, take delight in it. And if you see that you're missing some of the virtues that the Buddha has taught about, then aspire to develop them. Think about how can I develop them and work towards developing them. So this is how we can use the Dharma like a mirror. So on this point of developing virtues and overcoming and taming our faults, this is where the Buddhist definition of diligence needs to be kept in mind. So the normal definition of diligence just means to work hard at something. But, a criminal can be very diligent at planning his crime. So diligence can be applied to both the good and the bad aspect. But in Buddhism, diligence has a specific meaning. And in the Buddhist context, it means to actively tame and overcome our shortcomings while actively going about cultivating virtues. So there are 4 aspects. And the first is that faults that have arisen, we must work to eliminate them. Faults yet to arise, we must not let them arise. virtues yet to arise, we should work on developing them, and virtues that have arisen, we should work on perfecting them. So what that means is any shortcomings that we possess, we need to recognize them and then find ways to work on reducing them and eventually eliminating them. And any shortcomings that we don't have, we actually need to be on guard to never let them actually arise and develop within us. And vice versa, any virtues that we don't have at the present time, we should seek to develop them. And any virtues that we do have already, we should work on extending them, expanding them, and perfecting them. So this is the Buddhist definition of diligence. So remember, Buddhism is not just all about suffering. Sometimes the word emptiness and suffering tends to bring on a negative connotation. But Buddhism is not just about focusing on suffering, defilement, and negativity. It equally embraces joy, virtues, and positivity. So in summary, listening to the Buddha Dharma should be adopted as a key principle if one chooses to cultivate the path. So this is referring to those who are serious about practicing the path and not those who are treating Buddhism as a subject of interest. So this means that after we listen to Dharma teachings, we must be able to eventually realize it in practice. And this is the most important point when listening to and learning the Dharma. If you develop the skills properly and you can contemplate on the teachings properly, this will then help you to put it into practice. Of course, depending on where you are on the path, the amount of listening and the type of listening may vary. For example, as an absolute beginner, listening and learning the Dharma should be priority. And the focus can be more on the basic doctrines and meanings of terms, etc., so that you can establish a firm and correct understanding, establish your foundation of the Buddha Dharma's function, purpose, and ultimate goal. So this is a bit like primary school and high school years of schooling, where we learn our ABCs, we learn our maths, science, history, arts, geography, and so forth. We're building our foundation. And during these years of learning, we can actually start to begin to apply what we have learned in our daily lives, but it's still a bit limited. However, after establishing a good foundation, we can then progress to the intermediate and more advanced levels, where we can consider focusing on specialized topic areas that suit your spiritual foundation. So, for example, some people may choose to spend a few years consolidating their meditation skills or focusing on a specific sutra and its practice, etc. So this is a bit like the university or college years, where we can choose a major subject area, a major field of study, and then study that in more depth. But remember, this is only possible if you have a solid foundation from the primary and high school years. And at this stage, the application of what you learn in your daily lives can actually become much more effective, and much more of it can begin to be used in your daily lives. As you become even more advanced in your chosen method of practice and study, we must not neglect the basics. So it's actually a good idea to review some of your previous studies and undertake refresher courses to ensure that you keep up your skills and knowledge base so that when you practice and apply the Dharma, you can become more skillful. It'll be more extensive and far-reaching. So this is a bit like the professional years when you're actually out into your career in your chosen field. So after you graduate from university or college, working in that field, you're immersed in your study, but it becomes part of your work. It's no longer a dry textbook type of study where you then have to sit for exams and so forth. But here, even as you work as a professional in that particular field, you need to have ongoing study requirements to maintain those skills and to maintain your qualifications. So you can think about approaching the learning of the Dharma in a similar way to our education and preparation for our career, and slowly understand that from the initial textbook and rote learning, you need to eventually become merged with your study of the Dharma. So it just becomes a natural part of your life and your lifestyle. So this is the next verse. And here, although the righteous Dharma can be accessed and understood through reading the scriptures, nonetheless, the main method of learning the Dharma must be from listening to teachings by Dharma teachers. Listening to the instructions of Dharma teachers is a much faster and easier way to learn the Dharma compared to trying to read the scriptures by yourself. And so here, verse number 4 says, "One who wants to understand the righteous Dharma should associate with good spiritual guides who possess virtues, know the Dharma, penetrated the truth, have great compassion and eloquence." So I'll just give you some time to copy down this verse, and then we'll go into the detailed explanation of it. Hey, are you ready?
I believe Faye is in a meeting, Venerable.
Okay. Can I proceed now? Is everyone ready? Has everyone copied it down?
Not yet. I'm still copying.
Okay. Are we all done?
Yes, I'm done.
Okay. Right. So listening to the teachings from a teacher does not mean to just attend a class or two. If one wants to understand the Dharma properly and thoroughly and progress in their practice on the Buddha path, one also needs to think about associating with good and wise people. Now, these good and wise people are called good spiritual guides or Kalyana Mitra in Sanskrit. So the Sanskrit word Kalyana Mitra means a good friend, and in particular, it is a spiritual friend who gives you good advice, guidance, and encouragement. So from this, we need to reflect. If we want to be a good friend to others, not only should we give them good advice, but we should also give them encouragement. So back to our education analogy. Although there are many options nowadays for self-learning, we can do classes online at our own pace. However, there is still a component that relies on a teacher. Whether the teacher appears in person in an actual classroom, or whether you connect with the teacher over the phone or via some virtual app. Now, when we read textbooks and so forth, we can get a certain distance by ourselves, but we need to engage with a good teacher to confirm if our understanding and our application is correct, particularly at the beginning of our practice or when we begin a new text that we haven't studied in the past. We need to find a good teacher that can help us, a bit like a sounding board. If you want to learn on your own, some people who do that, they self-study, but without double checking with a good teacher, a wise teacher, there's no guarantee whether or not they're on the right track, whether their interpretation is correct and so forth. So for our own sake, to make sure we don't go on a tangential path, it's good to make sure we find a good teacher that can give us some guidance, advice, and encouragement. And this is especially important in the early learning phase. So having the explanation from a good teacher can actually help us learn much faster. And with their encouragement, if ever we fall into a bit of a slump, a bit of a dip in our practice, their encouragement can actually help us get out of that ditch much faster. And this is something that a book, an inanimate object, cannot do for us. The Buddha once taught that there are 4 factors for entry into sagehood. Now, these 4 factors are: 1, associating with good spiritual guides; 2, learning the righteous Dharma; 3, contemplating the Dharma properly and thoroughly; and 4, practicing the Noble Eightfold Path for the sake of nirvana. So from these 4 factors for entry into sagehood, and here when we refer to sagehood, it means to enter into the stages where one has a degree of experience with awakening or enlightenment. So in the Sravakayana sense, we're talking about at least the first fruition of arahatship or higher. So any practitioner who has attained the first fruition of arahatship or higher, they're considered as having entered the stage of being a sage. So when we look at this and understand the importance, because the first factor is associating with good spiritual guides. So this is a good indicator to tell us that it's having good teachers by our side, having wise friends by our side is crucial for our practice. So then what are the requirements to become a good spiritual guide? A good spiritual guide is not determined based on how many followers or disciples they have, and nor can one be judged by how many temples they have or how big their temples are. And a good spiritual guide certainly cannot be judged by their physical appearance or simply by their knowledge of worldly and Dharma topics. So this is important to keep in mind, because at times some people may see a certain monk or nun have a lot of followers and then they assume that's a good teacher for me. Or some people may see a really large and beautiful monastery and think that the teachers here must be very good. And then you have the opposite situation where a monk or a nun may not be so good looking or has incurred an injury, a deformity of some sort. And then people choose not to approach them. So all of these are worldly approaches to judging people, and we should be mindful not to apply these superficial habits to the Buddha Dharma. So when we're looking for good spiritual guides, we should watch out for the following 5 qualities. And note that these are the Mahayana qualities concerning a good spiritual guide, because Venerable Yingsun's teaching in The Way to Buddhahood, as the title says, is to seek Buddhahood. So the first quality is that they should be accomplished in virtues. Now here, it's referring to the accomplishment of the 3 studies of precepts, meditation, and wisdom. In other words, they must be accomplished in the purification of wholesome precepts. So they must have studied the precepts, practiced the precepts, and have attained a certain level of accomplishment in this particular study. And then they must have also attained meditative concentration levels, as well as developed insight wisdom. Now, generally, if you find someone who has all 3 accomplishments in the studies of the precepts, meditation, and wisdom, they have already entered the level of the sages. So that means they have already gained partial or full enlightenment. The second quality that a good spiritual guide should possess is the virtue of studying the Dharma. So this means that they should have a deep understanding of the Buddhist canon, which refers to having accomplished the practice of extensive learning of the Dharma. So this doesn't just relate to having knowledge. Their extensive learning should incorporate the ability to explain the Dharma, to teach the Dharma, and guide others to progress in the cultivation of the Mahayana path using the Dharma. The third quality is having penetrated the truth. The truth is called the righteous Dharma in this particular context, and penetrating the truth here can arise from accomplishing the wisdom of true realization, which means they possess undefiled wisdom. Now, that's one way of fulfilling this criteria. Another way is from thoroughly understanding the doctrines through developing the wisdom of listening and the wisdom of contemplation. So this is referring to accomplishment of the wisdom of learning and or the wisdom of contemplation. So for those of you who have attended some of the previous lessons, this is referring to the path of development of wisdom, where you start with the wisdom of learning, then you move to the wisdom of contemplation, and then the wisdom of practice, which ultimately leads to the wisdom of true realization. Now, at these levels of the wisdom of learning and contemplation, attainment of undefiled wisdom is yet to be achieved. But the accomplishment of the earlier stages of the wisdom of learning and the wisdom of contemplation indicates that this person actually has some experience and insight and is considered quite advanced compared to the ordinary practitioners. So having this level of wisdom is still very good and certainly someone worthy of us to learn from and associate with. So in summary, this quality, this third quality of penetrated the truth, means that this particular person would have some depth of experience in the cultivation of wisdom. The fourth quality is possession of great compassion. Cultivation of great compassion, in this particular sense, this person would not be cultivating great compassion purely to gain fame or fortune for themselves. Rather, they are cultivating great compassion so that they can actually teach the Dharma with a pure and sincere motive. And that means they learn and they teach the Dharma for the sake of benefiting others, benefiting sentient beings. Now, the fifth quality is possession of eloquence. This means they must possess the skill of communication, such that they can bring across the messages of the Dharma clearly and so develop confidence in the listener. With eloquence, a good spiritual guide can skillfully teach the Dharma to different beings in a manner that is easy for the learners to understand, and therefore for the listeners to be able to develop and gain the benefits from the teachings they hear. So, if you find a person who has accomplishments in all five qualities, if you find someone who possesses all five of these qualities, they are a good spiritual guide. They are an extraordinary being. And my advice would be stick to them like super glue. Even if they try to push you away, which they won't because they have great compassion. But from your perspective, just stick to them like super glue because such people are very rare. So, but remember, we can also use this as a mirror and reflect on whether we can be a good spiritual guide to others, or we can reflect on when can we be qualified to be a good spiritual guide to others. And in that sense, as a mirror, we ask ourselves, how many of these five qualities do we possess? Or do we even possess the potentials or the seeds for these qualities to be nurtured within us? On the Bodhisattva path, we should make vows to meet with good teachers who can help us progress. But at the same time, we should also aim to become good teachers to help others progress as well. Unfortunately, in the era we're living in, and the era, the present era we exist in, it is very difficult to find a person that possesses all five of these qualities. Yet, the cultivation of the Dharma, the learning of the Dharma, cannot be accomplished without good teachers and wise companions. Therefore, practically speaking, we need to consider a slightly lowering of these standards. And we'll go through what are these alternatives after our break. So we'll take a 10-minute break now, and we'll come back and continue to look at how we can find a good spiritual guide given our current era. Okay, so let's continue with today's session. So, as I said, in our current times, it's very hard to find someone that is fully equipped with all 5 of these virtues and at the levels that has been described. So the sutras do tell us. So Buddha, in his wisdom, knew that we'll come across this problem one day. So the sutras actually do tell us that if a person has 1/8 of these qualities that a good spiritual guide should have, then we can still associate with such persons and learn from them. So in this respect, we can find guidance in the Mahayana Nirvana Sutra. So just to point out here that if you look up Nirvana Sutra, there is a Mahayana version and a Shravakayana version. So what we're referring to here, what we're basing the teachings on here is the Mahayana version of the Nirvana Sutra. And it teaches us about 4 types of persons that we can rely on as our teacher. And generally, these 4 types of people can be grouped into human bodhisattvas and sages that have attained either the first fruition of arahatship or higher. So the first type, or the first category, is an ordinary person, and this is the category of the human bodhisattvas. So the first type of person we can rely on, they are ordinary people who, although they have yet to eliminate all their defilements, however, these people have made the Bodhi vow and they have developed confidence in the Mahayana teachings. Moreover, they have also developed their understanding of the teachings and undertaken, as well as continue to undertake deeds that benefit sentient beings. So this first type of person is a human bodhisattva that is fairly well accomplished or have begun their bodhisattva practice. Now, the second type of person is one who has attained the first or the second fruition of arahatship. The third type is someone who has attained the third fruition of arahatship. And the fourth type of person is one who has attained the fourth fruition of arahatship. So obviously, the second, third, and fourth categories are enlightened beings, sages. But it is the first type of person that we are more likely to encounter in our particular time, in this era. And the Nirvana Sutra tells us that if we cannot meet with a human bodhisattva that is accomplished on the path, even if we meet with a human bodhisattva who has understood 1/16 of the meaning in the Dharma teachings, then they are still people that we can rely on to help us learn the Dharma. So here, for all those who take their mats really seriously, please do not take 1/8 and 1/16 literally. It's very hard to measure 1/8 of those 5 qualities and so forth. But what we should understand is when you see these types of fractions and numbers presented in the sutras, they're to indicate to you a portion or a large size or a small size. So here, 1/8 or 1/16 should be interpreted as indicating a portion, even if they have a fraction of these qualities. Then, if people who have correct and fairly good understanding of the Dharma teachings, but they may still have their defilements and shortcomings because they haven't fully awakened to the truth yet. They haven't accomplished the purification of the precepts and so forth. But because they have correct and reasonably good understanding of the Dharma teachings, they can still be a source of reliance, and we should associate with them and learn from them. But of course, we learn from their Dharma understanding, not the shortcomings that they have still to correct. So in short, given that the Dharma era we're living in, some people call it the Dharma ending era, the degenerate era and so forth, it will be hard to meet with good spiritual guides that meet all 5 requirements as discussed earlier. But that doesn't mean we have no hope of finding good spiritual companions. Now, although the ideal spiritual guide is hard to come by, remember that anyone who has attained some accomplishments in their practice and have a fairly good understanding of the Dharma, such that their cultivation surpasses our own, then there is no harm in associating with these people and learning from these people, because they can still offer us assistance to help us progress on our path to Buddhahood. And there is a Confucian saying, when traveling in a group of 3, there will certainly be one who can be my teacher. So this idea means that when in a group with several others, not necessarily just 3, it could be 3 or more, when in a group with others, there will certainly be at least one person, if not more, who have some skills and knowledge that they can impart on us. And so, again, using it like a mirror, I'm sure that there will be skills and knowledge that we have that we can impart on others in that group as well. So now we come to the next verse, which is teaching us about how to associate with our good spiritual guides and teachers. And that means after being lucky enough to meet with a good teacher, a good spiritual companion, how should we interact with them? How can we be a good student? So the verse here tells us, observe only virtues and not their shortcomings. Follow them accordingly and do not defy instructions. Buddha says they help us accomplish the whole path, and so practitioners should respect them. So regardless of whether the good spiritual guide we meet with fulfills all 5 qualities or only possesses a fraction of those qualities, if we do not associate with them in accordance with the Dharma, then we will still be unable to gain virtues and benefits from such association. So again, I'll give you some time to copy down this verse. Are we good to go? Anyone need some more time? Okay, so no response. I'll assume that we're good to go. Yeah, if you need to, I'll put these slides up again at the end of the lecture if you need to continue copying them down. So, one thing to bear in mind is that only the Buddhas are perfect in every way. Only Buddhas have completely ended all defilements, both subtle and coarse, and only Buddhas have perfected all virtues. So what that means is that any spiritual guide we meet with will not be perfect. Therefore, towards the spiritual guides we meet, we should observe their virtues and not focus on their shortcomings. And this is important because learning from spiritual guides is not only limited to formal classes where you actually study, actual teaching materials, textbooks, sutras, and so forth. Another way we can learn is from observing the good spiritual guide, observing their mannerisms and activities, such as how do they treat others and deal with matters. These are also important lessons that we can learn. Now, when they display good qualities, we should pay attention to those qualities and cultivate those qualities within ourselves. And in this way, even if the good spiritual guide we meet with only possesses a fraction of those 5 qualities, we can still gain benefits from associating with them and learning from them. In contrast, if we fail to observe and focus on their virtues, and instead we only pay attention to their shortcomings, such as, they have this fault, or they're not good enough in that area, then even if the spiritual guide we encounter actually has all 5 qualities, again, we will not gain much benefit from associating with them. And as mentioned earlier, good spiritual guides who possess all 5 qualities are also not perfect human beings. That means they are not completely without any shortcomings at all, unless they are a Buddha. So therefore, when we associate with good spiritual guides, we must always remind ourselves, what is our purpose of coming here? We are not here to find faults. Instead, we are here to learn from their virtues. If we can behave in the same way as they carry out themselves in terms of their virtues, then when we focus on people's virtues, we'll be able to find good teachers everywhere. We go because all we see are the virtues in others, and therefore we can aspire to learn and cultivate all different virtues in ourselves. When associating with good spiritual guides, spiritual companions, and teachers, an important aspect is to follow and adhere to the meaning or the purpose of their instructions. And in this respect, if you have any doubts, or if you are unclear about their teachings, unclear about their instructions, you can ask, and you should seek clarification so that you can actually follow the teachings and instructions properly. If you don't understand what the teaching is trying to get at, please don't just ignore it or defy the instructions. So an example here is, and some of you may have heard this example, in in Buddhist college, we were taught this story, and there was a little novice, and he was following his master, and they were traveling somewhere. I can't remember where. But they came across a river, and the river was quite swollen due to recent rains. And there was a young lady, a maiden in distress, basically. So she needed to cross the river, but she couldn't find a way to cross. So the master offered to carry her over. And without thinking much, she accepted, and he picked her up and walked across the river. And then once he crossed the river, he put her down and continued on. But the little novice, having just learned his precepts, and the important one of the precepts and rules he was taught was that being a male, you need to keep a distance from females. So no touching, no holding hands, etc. So he was absolutely stunned when his teacher, his master, picked up this young lady and carried her across the river. And all the while, he was just really perplexed because he was so focused on this rule, sticking to it strictly. We're not allowed to touch females. How can my master pick her up like that? So even after crossing the river, he kept thinking about it, and it just really annoyed him more and more. And eventually the master, knowing that he was a bit troubled, said, "What's wrong?" And so the little novice let it out and, sort of lectured his master and say, "How can you break the precepts? You taught me that we're not allowed to have physical contact with females, but you just picked that lady up and carried her over." So the master then replied, "I have put her down long ago. Why are you still carrying her with you?" So this is, although it's a bit of a funny story, but it's a very poignant example of, if you don't understand the teacher or the good spiritual guide's actions and behaviors, and they appear to be contradictory to what you've learned, seek clarification before carrying out judgment. And even when the teacher reprimands us for something, we should listen to the content of the lecturing and guard against developing hatred or ill will towards our teachers. So, of course, it's human nature to feel a bit sad and upset when we're scolded and we're told we did this wrong, we did that wrong. But as practitioners, we need to practice to set aside those emotional feelings and look at things objectively. Contemplate on the content of the reprimand and learn from that to improve ourselves. Now, if we do get stuck and we cannot let go of our teacher's so-called faults, we actually should find a way to repent. We need to repent and then find ways to overcome our unwholesome obsession with their faults and practice to turn our attention, or find ways to turn our attention to their virtues instead. Now, I recall when I was looking for a master to renounce, I asked a few of the monks and nuns that I knew back then, "How did you find your master?" And of course, the different venerables gave me different answers, but there was one answer that really stuck with me. And one venerable told me that I should have faith in causes and conditions. As long as I make the vow to find a good teacher, then I just need to be a good student. Being a good student is the cause, making vows is the cause, and when the conditions come together and I have developed that affinity with my good teacher, we shall meet. So just let causes and conditions take their path. But of course, we need to then make vows and practice to be a good student. So then how can we be a good student? What are the criteria of being a good student, which can then make Dharma teachers happy? Now, one worldly way is to make offerings of various gifts to Dharma teachers, in line with your own financial means, of course. Now, the aim here is not to bribe the teachers or to butter them up, certainly not. Rather, these gifts are a show of our sincerity towards the teacher. So, for example, if the teacher is a venerable, you can practice dana by offering some fruits or inviting them to a vegetarian lunch and so forth. Or if you know that the teacher is in need of certain items and you have those items or you can afford those items, you can consider offering that to your teachers. But remember, when you practice dana, it has to be done with both wisdom and compassion. So don't just give them something that you've found lying around the house and you realize, oh, this is still good, but I don't need it, so I'll give it to my teacher. So that's not wisdom and that's not compassion. Now, another form of offering or another form of dana that a student can practice is actually to provide service or assistance to their teacher or teachers. Here, the opportunity, I think, is much greater, in my opinion. So, for example, if the teacher lives in a monastery, you can offer help with chores around the monastery, gardening, maintenance, office work, etc. If the teacher is organising activities, Dharma classes, retreats, or other social activities or charitable works, you can offer assistance by joining the working organisation, the working committee. And if the teacher is unwell, you can offer assistance by helping them out. So an example was when I fell over and broke my leg, I was literally bedridden for 3 weeks, and a few of my students were very helpful. They came every few days and they brought me some food and snacks and so forth. So in this respect, if you think about the ways you can help your teacher, it's to show your sincerity, to show your concern. And so the more you upskill yourself, the more that you learn, the more skills you acquire, the more ways you can actually offer service and assistance to your spiritual teachers. Now, apart from offering dana of material goods and service and assistance, the absolute best way to make a teacher happy is to follow their guidance, to follow their teachings and to practice accordingly. And there is a Chinese saying, honor teachers and respect their doctrines. Now here, respect their doctrines. The word respect is not just a mental admiration. It implies physical compliance and application of the doctrines. So the Buddhist approach to respecting and associating with good spiritual guides perfectly portrays the meaning behind this saying. Now, although being a good student means we should take heed of what the teachers tell us and their instructions, but what if the teacher instructs you to undertake something illegal or immoral? You need to think about this. So in these situations, if you have sought clarification from the teacher and you have decided, no, what they're telling me to do is illegal or immoral, then you should not follow those instructions. And you should use a very tactful way, a very polite way, to indicate to your teacher that you can't follow these instructions. So being a good student and trying to make your spiritual guides and your spiritual teachers happy does not mean we disregard morality. As Buddhist practitioners, we do not follow blindly. Buddhism emphasizes wisdom, so we do need to think about things before we act. And so the best way we can gauge whether certain activities are acceptable or not is, of course, illegal includes whether it breaks the law, but it also includes whether it breaks the precepts, the Buddhist precepts. And that's why it's important as our fundamental teachings to learn about the precepts, to understand how you apply the precepts and under what conditions are there exceptions and how do you apply those exceptions and so forth, so that you can use the precept as your standard of measure to assess whether certain actions are wholesome or unwholesome. So if a teacher instructs you to do something that goes against the spirit of the precepts, you can and you should ask them why. And after getting their response and contemplating about it yourself, you then decide for yourself whether or not you follow. So please don't just follow blindly. Remember that the spiritual guides we meet with are likely to have shortcomings. And sometimes you can meet with a great teacher at the start, but who knows, a couple of years down the track, they may have gone off track as well. So always remember impermanence, but you can always rely on the principles in the Dharma and the rules in the precepts and Vinaya. So when learning and practicing the Dharma, it is impossible for us to gain benefits if we do not respect our teachers properly. So this is just like what is said in the sutra. If towards their teacher a student holds hatred, resentment, or hostility, then they have no means to obtain any virtues. So in this respect, we can actually take a step back and just think back to when we were at school. You know, when we attended class from a teacher that we actually liked, that teacher that we thought was cool, or we enjoyed their classes, we tend to absorb more. Compared to a teacher that we didn't like, we actually tend to absorb less of their lessons. So regardless of what the teacher is teaching, our attitude towards the teacher also impacts how much of the teachings we can absorb. Now, at one time, the Buddha praised the virtues of good spiritual guides, and Ananda commented, "A good spiritual guide is one who helps us reach halfway on the path of practice." And the Buddha responded, "Do not say such a thing. A good spiritual guide is one who helps us complete the whole path." Now, this particular conversation is found in Sutra 726 in the Samyukta Agama, and the parallel teaching is found in the Sutra 45.2 in the Samyutta Nikaya. Now, the content of this particular sutra is about associating with good spiritual guides. And one can interpret Ananda's comment as being, a good spiritual guide can help us complete half of the path, while the other half relies on our own effort. However, when you read the different versions of this sutra, in the Pali version, the Buddha's position can actually be understood as follows. Because what we learn comes from our teachers. They teach us about the noble path. So it is from their instructions, from their teachings, that we know how to practice and we can complete the whole path. So in other words, the message here is that the contribution of a spiritual guide to our practice cannot be split up so specifically. In a sense, if you think about a child who is born, they come from both parents. And you cannot really say, oh, this ear comes from the mum and that finger comes from the dad. So in a sense, they are 50-50 from mum and dad, but in another sense, they're also 100% from mum and dad. So this indicates how much the Buddha values good spiritual guides, and therefore practitioners should respect and make offerings to good spiritual guides. The virtues gained from associating with good spiritual guides are certainly clearly explained in texts, such as the Avatamsaka Sutra, particularly the part about Sudana's travels to visit 53 different teachers. So if you want to learn more about how to associate with spiritual guides, this is another text you can refer to, Sudana's Travels. And in fact, for those of you who have taken the Bodhisattva precept, you would know, but in the Brahmanet Sutra, the Bodhisattva precept number 35 actually says, a Bodhisattva must make great vows to be filial to their parents and Dharma teachers, to meet good spiritual advisors, friends, and colleagues who will keep teaching them the Mahayana Sutras and moral codes, as well as the stages of Bodhisattva practice. They should further vow to understand these teachings clearly so that they can practice according to the Dharma while resolutely keeping the precepts of the Buddhas. So this is precept number 35 in the Bodhisattva precepts. And here it highlights that as a Bodhisattva, when we recite our vows every half lunar month, one of them is that we vow to always meet with good spiritual teachers. So given the time, this is actually a good place to end today's lesson. Tomorrow's lesson, we will begin with looking at the following verse. So I'll leave this up here for you to copy, and you can start contemplating and reflecting on this particular teaching, and we'll go through the details of it tomorrow.